There are cases that break the law, and then there are cases that break the soul. Late one evening, a mother rushed her disabled daughter, born with cerebral palsy, to the hospital after days of unexplained sickness, shaking chills, and a rising temperature she couldn't control. She expected a simple diagnosis, maybe an infection, maybe dehydration. She never expected the doctor to pull her aside, lower his voice, and say the sentence that collapsed her world. "Your daughter is pregnant." Her mind froze. Impossible. Unthinkable. Her child couldn't even walk on her own, couldn't defend herself, could barely communicate. On the drive home, her hands trembled on the steering wheel. Nothing made sense. No one had access. No visitors. No unsupervised outings. Back inside the house, still shaking, she heard her husband's computer ping, a notification, a sound she normally ignored. But tonight, it felt like a clue. She opened the device. What she saw shattered the last piece of her faith she has in humanity. Welcome to True Crime Story HQ. Thanks to all my viewers and subscribers for your support. Stay tuned for daily true crime updates. Don't forget to subscribe. Denise Marie Holloway came into this world in 1974 in a small apartment in East Cleveland, Ohio. She was the second of 4 children born to parents who worked themselves to the bone just to keep the lights on and food on the table. Her father spent his days doing maintenance at a Ford plant, coming home each night smelling of grease and exhaustion. Her mother cleaned houses for wealthy families in the suburbs, families whose children had bedrooms bigger than Denise's entire apartment. From a young age, Denise understood one fundamental truth about life. If you wanted something, you had to fight for it, and nothing worth having ever came easy. By the time she turned 16, Denise was already working part-time at a local grocery store, bagging groceries and stocking shelves to help her family make ends meet. She watched her parents sacrifice everything, and she promised herself that her life would be different. At 18, she became the first person in her immediate family to graduate high school, a milestone that filled her mother with tears of pride. Denise enrolled in community college with dreams of becoming a medical assistant, chasing the stability and benefits that had always eluded her family. She wanted a life where she didn't have to count pennies at the end of every month, where she could breathe without the constant weight of financial worry pressing down on her chest. At 22, Denise married her high school sweetheart, Devin Bradley. He was charming and ambitious, always talking about opening his own mechanic shop someday. For 2 years, they built what Denise believed was a good life together. When she discovered she was pregnant in 1998, Devin painted the nursery himself, picked out names, and told everyone at his job that he was going to be a father. But when baby Grace arrived in February 1999, everything changed. The doctors delivered news that would reshape Denise's entire existence. Her daughter had cerebral palsy. Grace would never walk normally, might never speak clearly, and would require lifelong care. Devin's excitement slowly faded into distance, then absence, then abandonment. By the time Grace was 2 years old, he left a note on the kitchen table and walked out of their lives forever, saying he didn't sign up for this. From 2001 onward, Denise raised Grace completely alone. She worked double shifts, learned every therapy technique, fought insurance companies, and battled school districts for accommodations. She slept 4 hours a night and considered it a luxury. Grace, despite her limitations, was a bright child with sharp eyes who loved music and laughed at cartoons. Denise built her entire world around that little girl, every decision filtered through one question: what does Grace need? She had no idea that years later, her devotion would be tested in ways she could never have imagined, and that the help she desperately needed would come wrapped in the disguise of a predator. Now, before we continue with this story, if you're finding yourself drawn into Denise's world and want to see where this journey takes her, take a moment to hit that like button, subscribe to this channel, and share this video with someone who needs to hear this story. Your support helps us bring more stories like this to light. By 2010, Denise had relocated to suburban Columbus for a better job opportunity, and she was running on fumes. 11 years of single motherhood had taken its toll, and the weariness was written in every line on her face. It was at a community potluck organized by her church that spring when she first noticed Harold Carter. He was 39 years old, 3 years her senior, divorced with no children of his own. He worked as an IT technician for a regional insurance company, the kind of quiet, unassuming man who fixed computers and kept systems running. There was nothing remarkable about him, nothing that would make you look twice on the street. And perhaps that was exactly what made him seem so safe. Harold Eugene Carter had grown up in rural Pennsylvania, the only child of a distant father and a mother who passed away when he was just 12 years old. He bounced between relatives throughout his teenage years before enlisting in the Army after high school. He served 4 years, never saw combat, and was honorably discharged in 1991. His first marriage had lasted 7 years, ending in divorce. According to Harold, it fell apart because his wife wanted children, and he wasn't ready. What he didn't mention, what Denise wouldn't discover until much later, was that his ex-wife had filed a restraining order against him in 2003, then mysteriously withdrew it. The details were sealed, buried in court records that nobody thought to check. Harold pursued Denise with a patience that felt refreshing after years of loneliness. He didn't rush or overwhelm her with grand romantic gestures. Instead, he simply showed up. He helped carry groceries without being asked. He fixed the squeaky hinge on her front door. Most importantly, he sat with Grace during Sunday dinners, and never once showed discomfort at her disability. Most men run, Denise confided to her sister Janet during a late-night phone call. They see Grace and suddenly remember they have somewhere else to be. Harold doesn't run, he just stays. For a woman who had spent a decade doing everything alone, Harold's steady presence felt like an answered prayer. But there were signs, small ones that seemed insignificant at the time. Harold was intensely private about his computer, always keeping his laptop locked in his home office behind a closed door. Work stuff, he explained with a shrug. Client data. I could lose my job if anything got leaked. He also had a peculiar habit of positioning himself near Grace during family gatherings, watching her with an attention that others might have described as caring or devoted. Denise saw a man who genuinely cared about her daughter. She had no way of knowing she was looking at something else entirely, something that would eventually destroy everything she held dear. Denise and Harold married in June 2012, in a small ceremony at her church with Janet serving as maid of honor. A handful of cousins and friends filled the modest pews, and Grace sat in the front row in a wheelchair decorated with white ribbons, beaming at her mother with pure joy. Harold suggested they honeymoon in Florida, but Denise couldn't bear to leave Grace for more than a day or two. Harold said he understood completely. That family always came first. At the time, those words sounded like devotion. Looking back, they were part of a carefully constructed performance. The first 2 years of marriage appeared stable by every outward measure. Harold took over the household finances, setting up direct deposits and creating budgets that gave Denise more financial breathing room than she had ever experienced. For the first time in her adult life, she wasn't living paycheck to paycheck, constantly calculating whether she could afford gas and groceries in the same week. Harold also took on responsibilities with Grace, driving her to physical therapy appointments when Denise's work schedule conflicted, learning how to assist with her leg braces, carrying her up the stairs on days when she was too fatigued to use her walker. Neighbors saw a patient stepfather. Church members saw a devoted husband. And Denise saw the partner she had prayed for during all those lonely years. The changes began so gradually that Denise couldn't pinpoint exactly when things shifted. In 2014, Harold suggested she cut back on her night cleaning job. "You're worn down," he said, with what seemed like genuine concern. "Grace needs you present, not burned out." It sounded reasonable, even caring, but being home more meant Denise noticed things she might have otherwise missed. Harold had started volunteering to give Grace her evening baths. "You've been on your feet all day," he insisted. "Let me handle it." He began insisting that Grace's bedroom door stay open at night, supposedly for safety. He installed new software on his computer that he claimed was for work security. And then there were the small comments Grace made, fragments of sentences that were difficult to understand, words that didn't quite connect. "Daddy, don't, like," she would say, her face twisted with effort. Denise assumed she was talking about vegetables, or bedtime, or some minor frustration her daughter couldn't articulate. She would comfort Grace, promise to fix whatever was wrong, and move on with the endless tasks of her day. She never paused long enough to consider that her daughter might be trying to tell her something far more important. The signs were there, scattered like breadcrumbs leading to a truth too horrible to contemplate. But Denise was too drained, too trusting, and too close to see the path they formed. By the way, I'm curious, where in the world are you watching this story unfold? Drop your location in the comments below, and if you've made it this far into Denise's story, let me know you're still here by commenting, "I am still here." Let's see who's truly invested in finding out what happens next. There is something crucial that must be understood about Grace Holloway, something that would later become central to both the investigation and the trial that followed. Grace was not intellectually disabled. Cerebral palsy affects motor function, not cognition. Her brain worked perfectly well, processing the world around her with complete clarity. It was her body that had become a prison. Her vocal cords produced sounds, but the muscles required to shape those sounds into clear speech often failed her. She understood everything happening around her. She felt everything done to her. She simply couldn't always communicate it in ways others could comprehend. By 19, Grace had developed coping mechanisms to navigate her silent world. She used a communication tablet, a simple device that allowed her to press buttons with pre-recorded phrases like, "Yes," "No," "I'm hungry," and "I need help." She also had a small vocabulary of words she could say clearly: mom, water, hurt, and stop. These 4 words would later take on devastating significance. What the prosecution eventually revealed through interviews with therapists and medical professionals was that Grace had tried to tell someone what was happening to her, multiple times. In 2015, during a physical therapy session, Grace became violently agitated when her male therapist touched her leg to adjust her positioning. She pulled away sharply and said, "No touch, no touch." The therapist noted it in his file as a behavioral episode related to sensory sensitivity. He never considered any other explanation. In 2016, Grace's home health aide reported that Grace seemed withdrawn and unresponsive on certain days, particularly after weekends when she had been home alone with Harold while Denise worked Saturday shifts. The aide mentioned her concerns to Denise, who brought it up with Harold. He suggested that Grace was simply going through phases, and his calm explanation seemed reasonable enough to quiet any concerns. By early 2017, Grace began having nightmares, waking up screaming with sounds that barely formed into words but carried unmistakable terror. Denise held her daughter, comforted her, and assumed it was anxiety or fear of the dark. When Grace managed to say, "Daddy, night, no," Denise interpreted it as her daughter asking for Harold to come say goodnight. She had it exactly backwards. Harold had weaponized Grace's disability against her. He told her that if she tried to tell anyone, her mother would be sent away. He said she would be put in a facility where nobody would visit her. He reminded her that no one would believe her anyway because she couldn't talk right. For 3 years, Grace lived in a house where her abuser was also her caretaker. She couldn't run. She couldn't fight. She couldn't speak clearly enough to be understood. And even when she tried, the people meant to protect her failed to listen. Harold had calculated every detail with chilling precision. The winter of 2017 arrived early in Ohio, bringing with it frost-covered windows and an unsettling sense that something in the Holloway household had changed. In late November, Grace began gaining weight in ways that seemed unusual. At first, Denise attributed it to the holidays. Grace had always loved sweet potato pie and the buttery rolls Denise baked from her mother's recipe. A few extra pounds during the holiday season seemed perfectly normal, nothing worth worrying about. But by January, the weight was concentrated almost entirely in Grace's midsection, creating a small, firm swell that Denise noticed while helping her daughter dress one morning. "She's bloated," Denise mentioned to Harold over dinner. "Maybe it's something she's eating. We should probably adjust her diet." Harold agreed without hesitation, suggesting more vegetables and less starch. Denise bought new pants for Grace, ones with elastic waistbands and looser fits that would accommodate her changing shape. She never once considered pregnancy as an explanation. The thought would have seemed absurd. Grace had never been on a date in her life. She didn't have friends who visited unsupervised. She left the house only for medical appointments, therapy sessions, and occasional church services, always accompanied by either Denise or Harold. The possibility that her daughter could be pregnant simply didn't exist in Denise's mind. More troubling than the physical changes were the behavioral shifts that accompanied them. Grace had always been affectionate with her mother, reaching for hugs and smiling brightly whenever Denise entered a room. But in early 2018, that warmth began to fade. When Denise tried to help with her morning routine, Grace flinched at her touch. When Denise brushed her hair, Grace cried without explanation. When Denise asked what was wrong, Grace would simply shake her head and stare at the floor, her eyes holding something that looked like defeat. Meanwhile, Harold's behavior shifted as well, though Denise failed to connect the dots. He began working from home more often, claiming the commute was tiring. He suggested that Grace's health aid wasn't necessary anymore since they were managing fine. By February, the aid's visits had been reduced to just once a week. One afternoon in early February, something happened that Denise would replay in her mind thousands of times in the months to come. She was helping Grace change into pajamas when Grace suddenly grabbed her mother's hand and pressed it firmly against her stomach. Denise felt the small, hard swell beneath her palm, and Grace looked at her with an expression that was part pleading, part exhaustion, and part surrender. "Grace, does your stomach hurt?" Denise asked gently. Grace didn't answer, just kept staring with those desperate eyes. "I'll make you some tea," Denise said, pulling her hand away. "Maybe you're constipated." She walked out of the room, completely missing what her daughter had been trying to show her. If you're feeling the weight of this story the way I am, if Grace's silent struggle is resonating with you, then please take a moment to like this video, subscribe to this channel, and share it with your loved ones. Stories like this one could help protect someone you care about from the same tragic fate. Your share might just save a life. On the morning of February 20th, 2018, Grace woke up vomiting. The retching sounds pulled Denise from her sleep before dawn, and she rushed to her daughter's room to find Grace pale, sweating, and unable to keep anything down. By noon, her temperature had climbed to 101 degrees. By evening, it had reached 103, and Grace's body had begun shaking with chills that no amount of blankets could stop. Denise tried everything she knew, administering Tylenol, applying cool compresses to Grace's forehead, pushing fluids that her daughter immediately rejected. Nothing worked, and the fever continued its relentless climb. Harold suggested they wait until morning. "It's probably just a bug going around," he said with casual dismissiveness. "Everyone at my office has been sick lately. She'll probably feel better by tomorrow." But at 9 o'clock that night, when Grace began convulsing in a way Denise had never witnessed before, the decision was made. "I'm taking her to the hospital," Denise announced, already reaching for her car keys. "Something is seriously wrong." Harold offered to drive, but Denise refused. She wanted to be in the back seat with Grace, holding her daughter's hand during the drive. "I'll wait here," Harold said as they headed toward the door. "Call me when you know something." At St. Michael's Regional Medical Center, the triage team took Grace back immediately. A high fever in a patient with cerebral palsy was a red flag that demanded urgent attention, signaling potential infection or other serious complications. The medical staff ran blood tests and urine samples, checking for urinary tract infection, kidney infection, and sepsis. And then, following standard protocol for any female patient of childbearing age presenting with abdominal symptoms, they ran a pregnancy test. Dr. Patricia Brennan reviewed the results herself in stunned silence before stepping into the hallway to find Denise. "Mrs. Holloway, I need to ask you some questions about your daughter's personal life," the doctor said quietly, her voice carefully controlled. Denise looked at her with confusion. "What do you mean, personal life? She's disabled. She can barely—" Dr. Brennan cut her off gently but firmly. "Mrs. Holloway, your daughter is pregnant. approximately 14 weeks. The words landed like physical blows. Denise's vision narrowed as the fluorescent lights seemed to flicker and dim around her. Pregnant. Her daughter, her sweet and helpless Grace, was pregnant. And Denise knew with immediate, visceral certainty that this was not consensual. Because Grace could not consent. Grace could barely communicate. The doctor explained the timeline, the gestational age pointing back to early November, and stressed that someone Grace trusted had been abusing her. Fear transformed into cold, creeping suspicion. Denise's mind began racing through the impossibly short list of people with access to her daughter, and one name kept surfacing no matter how hard she tried to push it away. Standing in the harsh, fluorescent light of the hospital corridor, Denise pulled out her phone with trembling hands. Confused and desperate for clarity, she needed to hear Harold's voice, needed to gauge his reaction to the impossible news she had just received. Her mind raced through every person who had ever been alone with Grace, but the list was impossibly short. Grace rarely left the house. Visitors were infrequent. The only people with consistent, unsupervised access to her daughter were the home health aide, a woman Denise had known and trusted for years, and Harold, her husband. She dialed his number, her heart pounding against her ribs. He answered on the second ring, his voice calm and measured. "Denise, is everything okay? How's Grace?" There was nothing unusual in his tone, nothing that should have alarmed her, and yet something felt wrong. "Harold, the doctors found something," she said slowly, choosing her words carefully. "What do you mean? Is it serious?" Denise closed her eyes and forced the words out. "Grace is pregnant." Silence filled the line. 3 seconds. 4. 5. And then Harold spoke, and something in his voice had shifted in a way that made Denise's skin prickle with unease. "That's not possible," he said flatly. "Someone else must be involved." Someone else must be involved. Not shock, not disbelief, not, "How could this happen?" Just immediate, practiced deflection. Denise's grip tightened on the phone as alarm bells began ringing in her mind. "The doctor says they have to report it to the police," she continued, keeping her voice steady. "They're required by law." And that's when she heard it clearly, the change in his breathing. Harold began to shake, the tremor audible in his voice, the breath of a man suddenly confronted with his worst fear. "The police?" he repeated, his words coming faster now. "Denise, let's not overreact. We should talk about this first, figure out what really happened before we involve anyone else." "Someone raped our daughter, Harold." The words came out harder than she intended. I know, he replied quickly, too quickly. "But we need to think about this carefully, about Grace's privacy, about what this could do to her if it becomes public." He was saying too much, filling the silence with words that sounded like reason, but felt like smoke. Denise's suspicion began to crystallize into something more solid. "I'm coming home," she said. "The doctors want to keep her overnight for observation." "Of course," Harold responded. "I'll be here. We'll figure this out together." Together. The word echoed in Denise's mind as she ended the call. For the first time in 6 years of marriage, that word sounded less like comfort and more like a threat. Something was very wrong with Harold's reaction, and Denise intended to find out exactly what he was hiding. "I want to take a moment to thank you for your incredible support. This channel exists because of viewers like you who believe these stories deserve to be told. If you want to take your support to the next level, consider joining our YouTube membership today. You'll unlock exclusive perks, enjoy premium content before anyone else, and help us continue creating the stories you love. The link is in the description below." The drive home from the hospital felt endless, every streetlight passing like a heartbeat counting down to something Denise couldn't yet name. She had left Grace under the care of the nursing staff, who had convinced her that one night of observation was medically necessary, given the fever and the pregnancy. Now she drove alone through the dark Ohio streets, her hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly her knuckles had turned white. Harold's reaction on the phone kept replaying in her mind. Not what he said, but how he said it. The deflection. The fear when she mentioned police. The desperate rush to control what happened next. The house looked exactly as it always had when she pulled into the driveway. Porch light glowing warmly. Harold's car parked in its usual spot. The blue flicker of the television visible through the living room window. Everything appeared perfectly normal, and yet nothing was normal anymore. Denise sat in her car for 5 full minutes, watching the house like it belonged to a stranger, trying to organize the chaos screaming through her mind. Something was wrong with Harold. Something was deeply, fundamentally wrong, and she needed to see it for herself. When Denise walked through the front door, Harold was sitting on the couch with his laptop open on his lap. He looked up quickly, too quickly, and immediately closed the laptop screen. "Hey," he said, attempting a casual tone that didn't quite land. "I've been waiting for you. Are you okay? How's Grace?" Denise studied his face with new eyes. The concerned expression was there, perfectly arranged. The right words came easily enough. But his hands told a different story. They were gripping the laptop like it was a life raft, knuckles white with tension. "She's stable," Denise said slowly, watching him. "They're keeping her overnight." Harold set the laptop aside, but not on the coffee table. He placed it on the cushion beside him, within easy reach. For the next 20 minutes, Harold talked without pause, theorizing about who might have hurt Grace. The physical therapist, he suggested, was alone with her sometimes. The home health aide had keys to the house. Perhaps a neighbor, a delivery person, someone Grace had encountered during one of her rare outings. Anyone. Everyone except himself. Denise listened and watched, noticing how his leg bounced nervously when she mentioned police interviews, how his eyes darted to the laptop when she said detectives might examine the house. Then Harold stood abruptly. "I need to use the bathroom," he announced, reaching for the laptop. He tried to take his laptop with him to the bathroom. At that exact moment, the computer pinged with a notification. Harold grabbed it quickly, too quickly, holding it against his chest like a shield. "Just work stuff," he said, his voice strained. "Updates from the server." But his carefully constructed composure had cracked. His face showed unmistakable panic. Denise's suspicion exploded into certainty. She waited until he left the room. Then she sat down in front of the laptop. The laptop screen glowed in the darkness of the living room, casting pale blue light across Denise's face as she sat down in front of it. Harold hadn't engaged the password lock in his rush to the bathroom, a small oversight that would change everything. The notification that had triggered his panic was still visible in the corner of the screen, a small pop-up that read, "Backup complete, 47 new files added to archive." Denise's finger hovered over the touchpad for a moment, her heart hammering so loudly she could hear it in her ears. Then she clicked. The notification opened a folder buried deep within the system files, hidden behind innocuous labels that would never draw attention. Inside were video files, dozens of them, each one labeled with a date, organized chronologically with meticulous precision. The earliest date was November 2015, over 2 years ago. The most recent was February 14th, 2018, Valentine's Day, just 6 days before this nightmare began. Denise's hands trembled as she opened the most recent file. The video began to play, and within the first 3 seconds, she recognized the setting. Grace's bedroom. The pink walls Denise had painted herself. The stuffed animals on the shelf. The hospital bed they had installed when Grace outgrew her childhood furniture. And then she saw him. Harold, moving toward the bed, his hands reaching for Grace's blanket. Denise watched for 7 seconds. 7 seconds was all she could endure before the reality of what she was seeing crashed through every defense she had ever built. This was her daughter. This was her husband. This was her home. And for more than 2 years, while Denise worked double shifts and collapsed into bed depleted each night, Harold had been violating the most precious person in her world. The pregnancy came from inside the house. The abuser had been sleeping beside her all along. Denise closed the laptop. She stood up, but her legs felt disconnected from her body, like they belonged to someone else entirely. The walls of the room seemed to bend and distort around her as she stumbled toward the kitchen. What she saw destroyed the last piece of faith she had in humanity. Everything Grace had tried to tell her, every sign she had missed, every moment she had been too busy or too depleted to truly listen, it all came crashing down on her at once. She gripped the kitchen counter to stay upright and opened her mouth to breathe. What came out instead was a scream. Not a scream of anger or fear, but something more primal. The scream of a woman whose entire reality had just been incinerated. From down the hall, she heard the bathroom door open. Harold's footsteps approached. "Denise, what's wrong? What happened?" The mother broke. She collapsed against the counter. And then she remembered the gun. Harold appeared in the kitchen doorway, his face arranged in an expression of concern that now looked grotesque to Denise. She stood with her back against the counter, the laptop clutched to her chest, her entire body shaking with a rage she had never known existed inside her. "Denise, listen to me," Harold began, his voice taking on the calm, reasonable tone she had once found comforting. "Whatever you think you saw, you're misunderstanding." He denied everything. He stood there in her kitchen, the kitchen where they had shared meals and talked about their days, and he denied the evidence of her own eyes. Misunderstanding? The word tasted like poison in her mouth. "Grace has been acting strangely lately," Harold continued smoothly. "You know that. She's been confused, agitated. Sometimes she does things, moves in ways that look inappropriate. I've been documenting it for her doctors to help them understand her behavior." The lie was so enormous, so audacious in its absurdity, that for a moment Denise could only stare at him. He was telling her that the videos documenting years of abuse were medical records. He was standing in front of her, looking her in the eye, and lying with the ease of someone who had been doing it for a very long time. "There are dates on those files, Harold," Denise said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Years of dates. November 2015. You've been doing this for over 2 years. Something flickered across Harold's face, a crack in the careful act he wore. And then he made his final fatal mistake. "You don't understand," he said, his voice dropping to something colder. "Grace isn't like other girls. She doesn't experience things the same way. She doesn't remember. She doesn't..." He blamed the daughter. He stood there and blamed the 19-year-old disabled girl he had been raping for years. He called her confused. He said she was damaged. And then he pointed the finger at Denise herself, saying she had been too stretched thin and too absent to notice what was happening right in front of her. Suddenly, Harold moved. He pushed past Denise, heading for the living room. He tried to grab the laptop, the evidence of everything he had done. "Give me that," he demanded, his voice sharp and commanding. "You don't understand what you're looking at." But Denise was faster. She grabbed the laptop first, clutching it against her body like a shield. Harold's eyes changed in that moment, the gentle stepfather and devoted husband vanishing completely. In his place stood something cold and calculating, something that had been hiding in plain sight for years. What happened next would be debated in courtrooms for months. Denise didn't remember making the decision. One moment she was holding the laptop. The next moment she was reaching into the kitchen drawer. Her fingers closed around the gun. The gun felt impossibly heavy in Denise's hand, a weight that seemed to pull her toward a decision she couldn't take back. Harold saw the weapon, and his face went white, all the color draining away in an instant. "Denise, wait," he said, his hands rising slowly in front of him. "Let's talk about this. You don't want to do something you'll regret." But regret was already consuming her. Regret for every sign she had missed, every cry for help she had failed to hear, every night she had slept peacefully beside a criminal, while her daughter suffered in silence just down the hall. In the chaos of that moment, with Harold moving toward her and demanding the laptop, with her mind fractured by the horror of what she had discovered, Denise fired. The sound was deafening in the small kitchen, a thunderclap that seemed to shake the very walls. Harold fell backward, his body hitting the refrigerator before sliding to the floor. Blood began spreading across his shirt from a wound in his shoulder. He was alive, gasping and clutching at the injury, staring up at her with shock and disbelief written across his face. "You shot me," he said, his voice thick with pain. "You actually shot me." Denise stood over him, the gun still raised, her hands trembling violently. A mother pushed beyond the limits of human sanity. A man exposed as a perpetrator. A family collapsing in the span of minutes. She could have pulled the trigger again. Part of her wanted to empty every bullet into the man who had destroyed her daughter's innocence. But something stopped her. Grace. Grace was at the hospital, alone and frightened, carrying a child conceived through years of abuse. If Denise killed Harold now, she would go to prison forever. Who would take care of Grace then? Who would protect her daughter from a world that had already failed her so completely? Denise lowered the gun slowly, her arm feeling like it weighed 1,000 pounds. Harold lay bleeding on her kitchen floor, making sounds of pain that meant nothing to her anymore. She walked to the phone and dialed 911, her voice eerily calm when the dispatcher answered. "I need an ambulance and the police," she said. "I shot my husband. He's alive. He's been raping my daughter." The dispatcher asked her to repeat herself. She did, word for word, with the same flat tone. But as she waited for the sirens to arrive, as Harold's blood pooled on the linoleum she had mopped just yesterday, Denise made another decision. One bullet had not been enough. Harold was alive. He would survive. He would hire lawyers and make excuses and try to blame Grace for everything. The gun had failed to deliver justice. She would need to find another way. The hours following the shooting passed in a blur of flashing lights and questions. Police officers took Denise's statement, while paramedics stabilized Harold and transported him to the hospital. The laptop was seized as evidence, its contents soon to be examined by digital forensic specialists who would uncover the full scope of Harold's crimes. Denise was questioned for hours, but not immediately arrested. The evidence on the laptop had already begun to confirm her story, and detectives were now focused on building a case against Harold, rather than prosecuting a traumatized mother who had acted in the desperate aftermath of uncovering her daughter's abuse. By late afternoon, Denise had been allowed to return home to the house where her daughter had been violated. She walked through the rooms like a ghost, seeing everything differently now. Grace's bedroom door that Harold had insisted stay open. The bathroom where he had given her baths. The couch where he sat with his laptop, organizing his collection of horrors. The rage that had temporarily subsided after the shooting began to build again, hotter and more focused than before. Harold was alive. He was being treated at the hospital for a shoulder wound that doctors said would heal completely within weeks. He would survive to face trial, where his lawyers would attempt to twist the truth, question Grace's reliability, and paint Denise as an unstable woman who had attacked her innocent husband. In the front closet, Denise found Harold's overnight bag, the one he always took when traveling for work. Inside, along with his toiletries and a change of clothes, was a bottle of Ambien, his prescription sleeping pills. 30 pills remaining. As she held the bottle in her hand, a new plan began taking shape in her mind. The shooting had been an act of impulse, a moment of temporary insanity triggered by the overwhelming horror of what she had learned. But what she contemplated now was something different. This was calculated, deliberate. A mother's cold determination to ensure that the man who had hurt her daughter would never forget what he had done. She knew Harold would come back. Despite everything that had happened, despite the evidence mounting against him, he would return to retrieve his things, to try one more time to talk his way out of consequences. Men like Harold always believed they could manipulate any situation, and when he walked through that door, Denise would be waiting. The police would handle the legal case. They would gather evidence and file charges and let the system work its slow, uncertain course. But Denise couldn't wait for the system. She couldn't trust that justice would be served. She had trusted before, trusted Harold with her daughter's life, and look where that had gotten them. This time she would take matters into her own hands. This time, Harold would pay in flesh and blood. Against all logic, Harold Carter returned home the following evening. His shoulder was bandaged and his arm hung in a sling, but his arrogance remained fully intact. The police had questioned him, but had not yet made an arrest as they continued processing the digital evidence. Harold seemed to believe, or had convinced himself to believe, that he could still talk his way out of this nightmare. He could still manipulate Denise the way he had manipulated her for years. He could still make his version of events become the accepted truth. His overconfidence would prove to be a fatal miscalculation. When Harold walked through the front door, Denise was waiting in the kitchen with a glass of orange juice on the counter. She had prepared for this moment, rehearsing her composure until she could appear calm and almost welcoming. "I made you some juice," she said, her voice carefully controlled. "You must be in pain." Harold studied her face, searching for the rage that had consumed her the night before. He didn't find it. What he found instead was something that should have terrified him if he had been smart enough to recognize it. The perfect stillness of a woman who had made peace with what she was about to do. Harold picked up the glass and drank deeply, the bitterness of the dissolved Ambien masked by the pulp and sweetness of the orange juice. "Thank you," he said, setting down the empty glass. "Now can we talk about what happens next?" Denise didn't respond, just watched him with those still, patient eyes. Within 20 minutes, Harold's words began to slur together. He stumbled toward the couch, his legs suddenly refusing to cooperate with his brain. "What? Denise, what's happening?" He tried to stand but collapsed back onto the cushions, his eyelids growing impossibly heavy. "I'm making sure you can't run," Denise said quietly, standing over him. Harold's face twisted with confusion and dawning fear. You put something... 30 milligrams of your own sleeping pills," she confirmed, her voice as cold as winter. "Enough to keep you still, not enough to kill you." Harold's eyes widened, or tried to, the drugs pulling him toward unconsciousness even as panic surged through his system. "Denise, don't what, Harold?" She leaned closer, close enough for him to see every line of grief and rage carved into her face. "Don't hurt you? Don't make you feel afraid? Don't make you feel helpless?" She paused, letting the words sink into his drugged consciousness. "That's all Grace felt for 3 years, every single night, and you did it anyway." Harold lay motionless on the couch, his body paralyzed by the Ambien coursing through his system, his mind trapped in a foggy twilight between consciousness and sleep. He could see Denise moving through the room, could register her presence, but he couldn't make his limbs respond to his commands. When she walked to the kitchen and returned with a knife, the blade catching the light as she approached, Harold finally understood that his manipulations had reached their end. There would be no talking his way out of this. There would be no lawyers or excuses or carefully constructed lies. There would only be Denise and her blade, and the terrible justice of a mother's love turned to vengeance. Denise didn't speak as she approached. Words seemed inadequate for what needed to happen next. For 3 years, her daughter had suffered in silence while Denise worked and slept and trusted the wrong man. For 3 years, Grace had tried to tell her what was happening, and Denise had been too busy, too depleted, too blind to see the truth. This was her penance, she thought, her redemption, her only way to make things right. When Harold managed to whisper, "Please," his voice barely audible through the drugs, Denise responded with the only words that mattered. "That's what Grace said. Did you listen?" What followed lasted approximately 15 minutes. The knife found Harold's shoulder first, then his arms as he tried weakly to defend himself, his abdomen, his legs. 11 wounds in total, each one delivered with a precision that came from somewhere beyond conscious thought. Denise avoided his heart and his throat. She wanted him to live. She wanted him to stand trial and face the public exposure of his crimes. She wanted him to spend decades in prison, where every inmate would eventually learn what he had done to a disabled girl, and where the justice of confined men would find him again and again until his final breath. Death would have been too easy, too quick. Harold Carter deserved to suffer for years, the way Grace had suffered. When it was finally over, Harold lay unconscious in a spreading pool of his own blood, his breathing shallow but persistent. Denise dropped the knife, the clatter of metal against floor sounding impossibly loud in the sudden silence. She walked to the phone, her movements mechanical, and dialed 911 for the second time in 2 days. "I need an ambulance," she told the dispatcher, her voice as calm as if she were ordering takeout. "My husband hurt my daughter, and I just hurt him. He's still alive. Send someone to 4127 Maple Ridge Drive." She hung up before they could ask any questions, then sat down at the kitchen table to wait. The sirens would come soon. The handcuffs would follow. But for the first time since opening that laptop, Denise felt something that might have been peace. The call came into Columbus Metro Dispatch at 9:03 p.m., the same address that had generated a shooting report just 2 nights before. Officers arrived to find flashing ambulance lights already illuminating the modest house on Maple Ridge Drive, neighbors gathering on their porches despite the February cold. Inside, paramedics were working frantically over Harold Carter, who lay in a pool of blood on the living room floor, his body bearing 11 stab wounds. He was unconscious, but breathing, his vital signs unstable, but survivable. In the kitchen, sitting exactly where she had sat 2 nights prior, was Denise Holloway, her hands folded calmly on the table, blood drying on her clothes and skin. "Ma'am," the lead officer said carefully, his hand resting on his service weapon. "Are you injured?" Denise looked up at him with eyes that seemed to see right through him. "No," she replied, her voice perfectly flat. "He is. The knife is on the floor. I drugged him first with his own sleeping pills, then I stabbed him. I wanted him to feel something." The confession was so matter-of-fact, so devoid of emotion, that the officers exchanged uncertain glances. This wasn't the demeanor they expected from someone who had just committed attempted murder. This was something else entirely. This was a woman who had crossed over into a place beyond fear or regret. Paramedics stabilized Harold and transported him to St. Michael's Regional Medical Center, the same hospital where Grace had been diagnosed with pregnancy just 2 nights earlier. His wounds were serious, including a collapsed lung and damage to his spleen, but not immediately life-threatening. He would survive his injuries just as he had survived the gunshot 2 nights before. Harold Carter, it seemed, was remarkably difficult to kill. Denise was placed in handcuffs, read her Miranda rights, and led toward a waiting patrol car. As she stepped out onto the porch, into the flashing red and blue lights, she spoke the only words she would say for the next several hours. "My daughter is at the hospital. She's disabled. She needs me. Please make sure someone tells my sister Janet to take care of her." The crime scene technicians would work through the night, documenting every detail of what had occurred in that house. They photographed the blood patterns on the floor and walls. They bagged the kitchen knife, still bearing traces of Harold's blood. They cataloged the empty bottle of Ambien and the glass that had contained drugged orange juice. And they secured the laptop that had started everything, the device that held evidence of crimes far worse than anything Denise had committed. What began as an attempted murder investigation was about to become something far more complicated, a case that would challenge the boundaries of law, justice, and human understanding. Detective Sarah Hartley had been working digital forensics for the Columbus Police Department for nearly a decade, examining countless computers and devices in cases ranging from fraud to homicide. She thought she had seen everything the darkness of human nature had to offer. She was wrong. When Harold Carter's laptop arrived at the forensics lab on February 23rd, marked as evidence in what was being called a domestic assault case, Hartley expected to find the usual assortment of files and documents. What she uncovered instead would haunt her for years. The laptop contained over 240 video files, meticulously organized in folders labeled by date. The earliest recording was dated November 2015, just 3 years after Harold had married Denise Holloway. The most recent was dated February 14, 2018, Valentine's Day, less than a week before Grace's pregnancy was revealed. Each video documented Harold Carter sexually assaulting his stepdaughter, Grace Holloway, a 19-year-old woman with cerebral palsy who could not walk without assistance and could barely communicate her own name. Hartley made it through 3 videos before she had to step outside the lab to compose herself. In her 10 years of forensic work, she had never encountered evidence this extensive, this systematic, or this deliberately preserved. The scope of the abuse was staggering. Based on video timestamps and file metadata, investigators determined that Harold had been assaulting Grace for approximately 2 years and 4 months. The frequency had increased over time. In the earliest videos, incidents occurred perhaps once a month. By 2017, the attacks were happening weekly. By early 2018, Harold was assaulting Grace nearly every other day. Many videos showed Grace attempting to resist, her weakened muscles pushing ineffectively against hands that were stronger. Her face turned away, her mouth producing sounds of distress that never formed into words anyone would hear. She had been trapped, completely at the mercy of a man who had no mercy to give. Medical examination confirmed what the videos showed. Grace Holloway was 14 weeks pregnant at the time of her hospital visit, the timing consistent with conception in early November 2017. DNA testing would later confirm what everyone already knew. Harold Carter was the father. The evidence was overwhelming, irrefutable, and absolutely damning. Digital forensics specialists found no indication that the files had been planted or manipulated. These were authentic recordings of years of systematic abuse, carefully organized and backed up by a violator who apparently never considered the possibility of being caught. Whatever crimes Denise Holloway had committed against her husband, whatever charges she might face for shooting and stabbing him, the evidence made one thing abundantly clear. Harold Carter was a perpetrator of the worst kind, and his stepdaughter's body carried the proof of his depravity. Denise Holloway waived her right to an attorney during her initial interrogation, a decision that surprised the detectives assigned to her case. Most suspects, guilty or innocent, immediately requested legal representation. But Denise seemed to operate on a different wavelength entirely, as if the normal rules of self-preservation no longer applied to her. She sat in the small interrogation room, still wearing clothes stained with Harold's blood, and answered every question put to her with clear-eyed honesty. "I would do it again," she said at one point, her voice steady and certain. "I would do worse." Detective Marcus Webb, a 20-year veteran of the force, conducted the interview. He had handled hundreds of interrogations in his career, but something about Denise Holloway unsettled him. This wasn't a woman in denial or shock. This was a woman who had weighed her options, made her choice, and accepted the consequences with remarkable clarity. "Mrs. Holloway, can you walk me through everything that happened?" he asked, his recorder capturing every word. And she did. She described the hospital visit and the devastating pregnancy diagnosis. She described calling Harold and noticing his reaction was wrong, too calm, too quick to deflect. She described coming home and watching him panic over a laptop notification, how he tried to take the computer with him to the bathroom. She described opening the laptop after he left the room, finding the folders, watching 7 seconds of video before understanding came crashing down. She described the first shooting, and then, in precise detail, she described returning the next day to finish what she had started. The Ambien in the orange juice, the knife from the kitchen drawer, 11 wounds, each one deliberate. "I wanted him to feel something," she explained. "I wanted him to know what it's like to be helpless." For the first 2 hours, Denise maintained her composure with almost eerie control. But when Detective Webb asked about the years of abuse, about the signs she might have missed, something finally cracked inside her. "She tried to tell me," Denise whispered, her voice breaking for the first time. "Grace tried to tell me so many times. She would say, 'Daddy, no,' and I thought she was talking about bedtime or vegetables. I was so worn down, so focused on just getting through each day, that I never stopped to really listen." Tears began streaming down her face, cutting tracks through the dried blood on her cheeks. And he threatened her. He told her no one would believe her because she couldn't talk right. He used her own body against her. The sobs came then, deep and wrenching, the kind of grief that seems to have no bottom. "I was supposed to protect her. That was my only job that ever mattered. And I failed." Harold Carter underwent emergency surgery on the night of the stabbing, his medical team working for 6 hours to repair the damage Denise had inflicted. He had suffered 11 stab wounds resulting in a collapsed lung, significant damage to his spleen, and severe blood loss that required multiple transfusions. For 4 days, he remained in the intensive care unit, his condition critical but stable. Armed officers stood guard outside his room around the clock, ensuring that the man who would face some of the most serious charges in Franklin County history didn't slip away before justice could find him. Even from his hospital bed, Harold Carter attempted to construct a defense. When investigators came to question him, he stuck to the same story he had tried to sell Denise. The videos were medical documentation, he claimed, recordings intended to help Grace's doctors understand her behavioral issues. He painted himself as a devoted stepfather who had sacrificed years of his life caring for a disabled child, while her biological father was nowhere to be found. He portrayed Denise as unstable, prone to irrational outbursts, a woman whose mental health had deteriorated under the strain of caregiving. "She attacked me without provocation," Harold insisted, his voice weak but his manipulation as strong as ever. "Twice. She's dangerous and delusional." His court-appointed attorney, a public defender named Christopher Daniels, reviewed the evidence before their first meeting. Daniels was a seasoned defense lawyer who had represented clients accused of everything from armed robbery to manslaughter. He had learned long ago to approach cases without moral judgment, to focus on legal strategy rather than personal feelings. But after viewing just 3 of the 240 videos recovered from Harold's laptop, Daniels excused himself from the room and stood in the hallway for 10 minutes, breathing deeply, trying to regain his professional composure. He requested to be removed from the case that same afternoon, citing irreconcilable personal conflicts. Harold's replacement attorney, Daniel Foster, would later describe the evidence as the most damning collection I've encountered in 30 years of practice. There was no defense strategy that could explain away 240 videos spanning more than 2 years. There was no alternative narrative that could account for a disabled woman's pregnancy. The charges filed against Harold Carter reflected the full weight of his crimes. 47 counts of first-degree sexual assault of a disabled person, 47 counts of producing child sexual abuse material, 1 count of aggravated incest as Grace's legal step-parent, multiple counts of child endangerment, and felony child abuse. He faced a maximum sentence of life in prison without the possibility of parole. The man who had hidden behind a pretense of kindness and devotion was finally exposed, and there would be no more hiding. The case of Denise Holloway presented Franklin County District Attorney Helen Whitmore with one of the most challenging decisions of her career. On one hand, the facts were undeniable. Denise had shot her husband, then returned the following day to drug and stab him 11 times. These were serious crimes, premeditated to some degree, resulting in grievous bodily harm. Under normal circumstances, such actions would warrant charges of attempted murder, carrying potential decades in prison. But these circumstances were anything but normal, and Whitmore found herself weighing justice against mercy in ways the law rarely required. Public sentiment had already rendered its verdict. Within days of the case becoming public, online petitions calling for all charges against Denise to be dropped had accumulated over 200,000 signatures. News coverage painted her not as a criminal, but as a heroic mother pushed beyond human limits by the revelation of unspeakable abuse. Legal commentators debated whether the justice system should even pursue charges against a woman who had acted in defense of her daughter. Victim advocacy groups lined up to testify on her behalf, arguing that her actions, while technically criminal, represented a response to trauma that the law was poorly equipped to address. After weeks of deliberation with her prosecutors and extensive consultation with mental health professionals, Whitmore announced a compromise. Denise Holloway would be charged with second-degree assault rather than attempted murder. The prosecution acknowledged that she had acted out of emotional distress, trauma, and temporary insanity triggered by learning of the abuse. The reduced charges carried a maximum sentence of 7 years, with the possibility of a suspended sentence pending psychiatric evaluation and demonstrated rehabilitation. "This office does not condone vigilante justice," Whitmore stated at the press conference announcing the decision. "But we also recognize that this defendant was subjected to psychological trauma of extraordinary magnitude. The The circumstances of this case are unlike any I have encountered in my career. On April 14, 2018, Denise Holloway stood before the court and pleaded guilty to second-degree assault with aggravating circumstances. Before accepting her plea, the judge allowed her to make a statement. Denise stood straight despite the weight pressing down on her shoulders and spoke clearly. "I am not sorry for what I did," she said, her voice carrying to every corner of the courtroom. "I am only sorry that I didn't learn the truth sooner. I failed my daughter for 2 years, while that man violated her under my own roof. I will spend the rest of my life trying to make that right, trying to forgive myself for not listening when she needed me most. But I will not apologize for trying to protect her. I will never apologize for that." The trial of Harold Eugene Carter began on September 4, 2018 in Franklin County Courthouse. The proceedings lasted 11 days, during which the prosecution, led by Assistant District Attorney Rebecca Thornton, presented a case so thorough and devastating that even seasoned courtroom observers struggled to maintain their composure. The evidence room contained copies of all 240 videos recovered from Harold's laptop, each one authenticated by digital forensics experts who testified to their origin, their timestamps, and their horrifying contents. Medical professionals took the stand to describe Grace's injuries, her pregnancy, and her complete inability to consent to any sexual contact. The most powerful moment came when Grace Holloway herself was called to testify. A hush fell over the courtroom as she was wheeled to the witness stand, her communication tablet resting on her lap. Grace had never testified in court before, had never spoken to anyone outside her immediate circle about what had happened to her. But she had insisted on facing Harold, on looking at the man who had stolen her innocence and telling the world what he had done. The prosecutor asked simple questions, designed to be answered with the basic vocabulary Grace could manage. "Grace, did Harold touch you in ways that made you uncomfortable?" Grace pressed a button on her tablet. The synthesized voice spoke clearly. "Yes." "Did this happen more than once?" "Yes." "Did you try to tell anyone what was happening?" Grace looked across the courtroom at her mother, who sat in the gallery with tears streaming down her face. "Yes." "Did anyone listen?" A long pause. Grace's fingers trembled over the tablet. Then she pressed the button. "No." The word hung in the air, an indictment not just of Harold Carter, but of every system and every person who had failed to hear a disabled girl's cries for help. Harold's defense attorney attempted to challenge the reliability of Grace's testimony, suggesting that her disability made her an unreliable witness, that she might have been coached or manipulated. The jury was not persuaded. After 6 hours of deliberation, they returned unanimous guilty verdicts on all 47 counts of sexual assault, all 47 counts of producing abuse material, and every other charge the prosecution had filed. Harold Carter sat motionless as the verdicts were read, his face betraying nothing. The judge scheduled sentencing for the following month, but everyone in that courtroom already knew that Harold would spend his remaining years behind bars. The criminal who had hidden in plain sight, who had presented himself as a devoted husband and caring stepfather, had finally been unmasked for the violator he truly was. Harold Carter's sentencing hearing took place on October 15, 2018, before Judge Patricia Morrison in the same courtroom where he had been convicted. The gallery was packed with spectators, reporters, and advocates who had followed the case from its earliest days. Victim impact statements had been submitted by Grace's therapists, her medical team, and family members who described in painful detail the lasting damage Harold's abuse had inflicted. When given the opportunity to speak on his own behalf, Harold showed not a trace of remorse. "I cared for that girl when no one else would," Harold said, his voice steady and defiant. "I was there for her when her own mother was too busy working to pay attention. Whatever happened between us, it wasn't what they're saying. Grace is confused. She's always been confused." The audacity of his statement drew gasps from the gallery. Here was a man convicted on overwhelming evidence, including 240 videos he had personally recorded, and he was still attempting to blame his disabled victim. Judge Morrison listened without expression, then delivered a sentence that would ensure Harold Carter never harmed another child. "Mr. Carter," the judge began, her voice carrying the weight of the court's full authority. "I have presided over this bench for 18 years. I have sentenced murderers, rapists, and career criminals whose crimes shocked the conscience of this community. But I have never encountered a defendant as devoid of human decency as you. You exploited a child who could not speak for herself. You violated the most sacred trust a parent can hold. You recorded your crimes as if they were trophies to be collected and preserved." She paused, letting her words settle over the silent courtroom. "You will be sentenced to 65 years in federal prison without the possibility of parole. You will die behind bars. And that is precisely what justice demands." 1 month later, Denise Holloway stood before the same judge for her own sentencing. The psychiatric evaluation submitted to the court described an acute dissociative episode triggered by the traumatic revelation of prolonged abuse. Mental health experts testified that her capacity for rational decision-making had been severely compromised by overwhelming psychological trauma. Taking all factors into consideration, Judge Morrison sentenced Denise to 3 years in a women's correctional facility, with eligibility for early release after 18 months pending good behavior and completion of therapy. "Mrs. Holloway," the judge said, her tone notably gentler than it had been for Harold, "what you did was a crime. But you were driven to that crime by circumstances that would push any loving mother to her breaking point. I hope that when you are released, you will find peace." In the chaos that followed Denise's arrest, the question of who would care for Grace became immediately urgent. She was 19 years old, pregnant, traumatized, and completely dependent on others for her daily survival. Social services contacted Janet Williams, Denise's younger sister, within hours of the stabbing. Janet was a 41-year-old high school guidance counselor who had always maintained a close relationship with her niece, helping with caregiving during Denise's most stretched years. She understood Grace's needs, her routines, her methods of communication. When the caseworker asked if she would be willing to take temporary guardianship, Janet didn't hesitate for even a second. "That girl has been through enough," Janet told the caseworker firmly. "She's not going to some facility where nobody knows her. She's coming home with me." The transition was not simple. Grace required specialized equipment, including a hospital bed, a hydraulic lift for transferring to her wheelchair, and extensive bathroom modifications for accessibility. Janet spent her life savings converting her guest room into a space that could accommodate her niece's needs. Friends from her church volunteered to help with the construction, and neighbors who had once waved casually at Harold Carter, thinking him a decent man, now brought meals and offered whatever support they could provide. The question of Grace's pregnancy required careful navigation by medical professionals and family members alike. Given the trauma she had experienced and the physical challenges posed by her disability, doctors presented various options and risks. But the final decision belonged to Grace herself, communicated through her tablet with the support of a trauma-informed therapist who had been working with her since the abuse was revealed. Using her limited vocabulary and the buttons on her device, Grace made her wishes clear. She wanted to keep the baby. "Baby," she spelled out carefully when Janet asked what she wanted. "My baby." Janet later tried to explain Grace's decision to those who questioned it. "Some people couldn't understand why she wanted to keep a child conceived through rape," Janet said in an interview months later. "They thought it would be a constant reminder of what happened, a burden she didn't need. But here's what I understood. For 19 years, Grace had been defined by what she couldn't do. She couldn't walk. She couldn't speak clearly. She couldn't protect herself. But being a mother, that was something she could do. That baby was the only thing in her life that was truly hers, the only thing she had chosen for herself. She wanted to be a mother, and who was I to take that away from her?" As the months passed and Grace's belly grew, Janet watched her niece transform. Despite everything, despite the horror and the trauma and the impossible circumstances, Grace was preparing to bring new life into the world. Grace's pregnancy was classified as high risk from the moment it was confirmed, requiring the coordinated attention of specialists who rarely work together. Her cerebral palsy affected muscle control throughout her body, creating potential complications for labor and delivery that had to be anticipated and planned for months in advance. A team of obstetricians, neurologists, and physical therapists at Ohio State University Medical Center prepared for every contingency, conducting weekly examinations and developing detailed protocols for various emergency scenarios. By late summer, as Grace entered her final weeks of pregnancy, the entire medical team was ready for whatever challenges might arise. On August 17, 2018, Grace went into labor. Janet rushed her to the hospital, where the specialized team was immediately summoned. The labor was long and difficult, complicated by Grace's physical limitations and the stress her body was under. After 12 hours of monitoring and intervention, the medical team made the decision to proceed with a cesarean section. Grace was wheeled into the operating room, Janet holding her hand until the very last possible moment, and at 11:47 p.m., a baby girl entered the world. She weighed 6 pounds and 4 ounces. She was perfectly healthy, 10 fingers and 10 toes, a loud cry announcing her presence to everyone within earshot. When the doctors placed the infant on Grace's chest for the first time, something happened that everyone in that room would remember forever. Grace's arms, which were often weak and uncooperative due to her condition, wrapped around her daughter with surprising strength. She looked down at the tiny face, at the closed eyes and the rosebud mouth and the impossibly small fingers, and she smiled. Not a small smile or a tentative one, but a smile of pure, uncomplicated joy. "My baby," she said, and the words came out clear, unmistakable, stronger than almost anything she had ever spoken. The nurses and doctors exchanged glances, moved by a moment they would describe to their families that night. Janet asked what Grace wanted to name her daughter, and Grace laboriously spelled out the answer on her communication tablet, pressing each letter with careful determination. H-O-P-E. "That's what she is," Grace managed to say through her tears. Hope. It was a name that seemed to rewrite the narrative of everything that had come before. This child had been conceived in violence and trauma, her existence a constant reminder of the worst thing that had ever happened to Grace. But Grace refused to see her that way. To Grace, this baby represented possibility. This baby represented the future. This baby represented proof that even from the darkest circumstances, something beautiful could emerge. Hope. A name that was also a prayer, a declaration, a promise that the cycle of pain would end here, and something new would begin. Denise Holloway entered the Ohio Reformatory for Women in Marysville on November 28, 2018, just 3 months after her granddaughter's birth. She had expected to feel anger during her first days of incarceration, bitter resentment at a system that was punishing her for protecting her child. Instead, she found something unexpected: relief. For the first time in nearly 2 decades, she had no responsibilities beyond her own survival and healing. No double shifts to work, no medical appointments to coordinate, no bills to worry about, just time. Vast, empty stretches of time to think, to process, to understand how she had missed what was happening within those walls she once called home. The therapy sessions mandated by her sentence forced Denise to confront the guilt that had been eating at her since the night she opened Harold's laptop. She reviewed every moment of the previous years with her therapist, every sign she had missed, every fragment of communication from Grace that she had dismissed or misunderstood. "I was so focused on surviving," she said during one particularly difficult session, "that I stopped really seeing my daughter. I trusted Harold because trusting him made my life easier. She paid the price for my blindness." The guilt was a weight she would carry until her final breath, but the therapy gave her tools to bear it without being crushed. Every week, Denise wrote letters to Grace. She described her days in prison, the routine she had established, the small moments of connection with other inmates who had their own complicated stories. She asked about Hope constantly, wanting to know every detail of her granddaughter's development. Was she sleeping through the night? Had she smiled yet? What did she like to eat? Grace, with Janet's help, wrote back using her tablet. The letters were simple and short, sometimes just a few sentences, but they maintained a connection that distance and prison bars could not sever. "Mom, love you. Hope growing. See you soon." Janet brought Grace and Hope to visit Denise once a month, driving the 2 hours to Marysville with Hope strapped in her car seat, babbling happily at the passing scenery. The first visit, when Denise was allowed to hold her granddaughter for the first time, she wept for 20 minutes without stopping. Hope was 4 months old, already developing her own personality, her eyes full of curiosity about this crying woman who held her so tightly. "She's so beautiful," Denise whispered into Hope's tiny ear. "She's the most beautiful thing I've ever seen." Hope reached up and grabbed Denise's finger, gripping with surprising strength, and something broken inside Denise began, very slowly, to mend. While Denise served her time in the relative calm of a women's correctional facility, Harold Carter faced a very different kind of incarceration. Following his conviction and sentencing, he was transferred to a federal maximum security facility, where his crimes preceded him like a scarlet letter. In the unofficial hierarchy that exists within American prisons, certain offenses mark an inmate for particular treatment. Drug dealers occupy one rung, murderers another. But at the very bottom of that hierarchy, despised by criminals and guards alike, are men who hurt children. Harold Carter's case had received national media coverage, and every inmate in his facility knew exactly who he was and what he had done to his disabled stepdaughter. Within his first month of general population, Harold was assaulted twice. The first attack left him with a broken nose and 2 cracked ribs. The second was more severe, requiring emergency medical treatment for internal bleeding. Prison officials, recognizing that Harold would not survive long among the general population, made the decision to transfer him to protective custody. This meant solitary confinement, isolation so complete that it resembled burial more than imprisonment. 23 hours a day in a cell the size of a parking space, 1 hour of recreation, alone, in a concrete yard no bigger than a basketball court. No contact visits with family or friends, not that anyone was requesting to see him. No phone privileges beyond calls to his legal team. Harold's attorneys filed 2 appeals following his conviction, both of which were soundly rejected by the appellate courts. The evidence against him was overwhelming, irrefutable, and perfectly preserved in the video files he had so meticulously organized. His victim's testimony, limited as it was by her disability, had been corroborated by physical evidence, medical examination, and DNA testing. There were no grounds for appeal, no technicalities to exploit, no alternative narratives that could explain away the mountain of proof. Harold Carter would spend his remaining years behind bars, aging alone in a cell, forgotten by the world he had once manipulated so effectively. Reports from inside the facility suggest that Harold maintains his innocence to anyone who will listen, which is virtually no one. He has made no public statements of remorse. He has declined all interview requests from journalists and documentary filmmakers, seeking to understand how an ordinary-seeming IT technician could become such a criminal. He exists now in a limbo of his own creation, alive but cut off from humanity, breathing but not truly living. The man who had hidden behind a false front of kindness and devotion for so many years now spends his days staring at concrete walls, with nothing but his own thoughts for company. The abuser is behind bars, and there he will remain until the day he dies. Denise Holloway served 18 months of her 3-year sentence, earning early release through good behavior and successful completion of her court-mandated therapy program. On May 12, 2020, at precisely 8:00 a.m., she walked through the gates of the Ohio Reformatory for Women, a Free Woman. The morning was overcast, typical spring weather for Ohio, but to Denise, the gray sky looked beautiful. Everything looked beautiful. The parking lot, the chain-link fence receding behind her, the beat-up minivan where her sister Janet stood waiting, leaning against the driver's door with a smile that hadn't been that wide in years. But Janet wasn't alone. Grace was there too, her wheelchair positioned beside the van, and in her arms sat Hope, now 21 months old, wearing a pink dress that Janet had bought specifically for this occasion. Denise walked toward them slowly, almost hesitantly, as if moving too quickly might shatter the moment like glass. She had dreamed about this reunion for 18 months, imagined it during the long nights in her cell, pictured herself running into her daughter's arms. But now that it was actually happening, she felt almost afraid that too much had changed. afraid that Grace might not forgive her for leaving, afraid that Hope wouldn't recognize the grandmother she had only known through glass partitions and supervised visits. She stopped a few feet from the wheelchair, her eyes filling with tears. Grace looked up at her mother with an expression that held no anger, no resentment, only love. She reached out her arm, the gesture awkward but determined. "Mom," she said, the word coming out clear and strong. "Home. Come home." Denise fell to her knees on the asphalt parking lot, not caring about the rough surface or the tears streaming down her face, and wrapped her arms around her daughter. They stayed like that for a long time, mother and daughter, holding each other while Janet wiped her own tears, and Hope babbled happily, too young to understand the significance of what she was witnessing, but old enough to sense that this moment mattered. When Denise finally pulled back, she looked at Hope with wonder. The last time she had held this child, Hope had been barely able to sit up on her own. Now she was a toddler, with curly hair and curious eyes and a vocabulary of at least 20 words. "Gamma," Hope said, reaching toward Denise with chubby hands. "Gamma home." Denise laughed through her tears, the first genuine laugh she had produced in months. She took Hope from Grace's arms and held her close, breathing in the baby shampoo scent of her hair. The mother was home. The daughter was safe. The granddaughter was thriving. Against all odds, after everything they had endured, this family had survived. After her release, Denise moved into a small rental house just 2 streets away from Janet's home. The arrangement allowed her to be close to Grace and Hope while respecting the careful structure that Janet had built during the 18 months of Denise's incarceration. Janet remained Grace's primary caregiver, a role she had embraced completely, but Denise visited every day without exception. She helped with Hope's care, read bedtime stories, attended Grace's therapy sessions, and slowly rebuilt the relationship that had been fractured by years of exhaustion, misplaced trust, and terrible blindness. Family therapy became a cornerstone of their new life together. A trauma-informed counselor worked with all 3 women, helping them process what had happened and find ways to move forward without forgetting the past. Grace made remarkable progress in the years following the abuse. With intensive therapy and continued physical rehabilitation, she expanded her communication abilities beyond what anyone had expected. She learned to form simple sentences verbally and became proficient with advanced communication technology. She enrolled in a day program for adults with disabilities, where she made friends for the first time in her life, people who saw her as Grace rather than as a victim or a patient. And Hope grew. She grew into a curious, bright, joyful child who loved music and animals and spending time with her family. She called Denise Gamma and Grace Mama and Janet Auntie Jan, and she knew she was loved by all 3 of them with fierce, protective devotion. She knew that her grandmother had gone away for a while because of something complicated that happened before Hope was born. She knew that she had a grandfather who did very bad things and lived in a place where bad people go. She didn't know the full story, not yet. Denise, Grace, and Janet had agreed to tell her the truth when she was old enough to understand, to process, to decide for herself how to carry that knowledge. In a recent interview, Denise was asked how she had managed to move forward after everything that happened. She sat quietly for a long moment, looking out the window at Hope playing in the yard, chasing butterflies with her arms outstretched. "I used to think I was a failure," she finally said. "I missed what was happening to my daughter. I married the man who hurt her. I went to prison for trying to kill him. But then I look at that little girl out there, with her whole life ahead of her. And I look at Grace, who survived something that would have destroyed most people. And I think, maybe we're not failures at all. Maybe we're just people who went through hell and came out the other side." She smiled, tired but genuine. Hell doesn't get to define us. We define ourselves. The story of Denise, Grace, and Harold Carter is not merely a story of one family's private tragedy. It is a story about how the systems designed to protect our most vulnerable citizens can fail them completely and catastrophically. Grace Holloway saw medical professionals regularly throughout the years of her abuse. She visited doctors, attended physical therapy sessions, received care from home health aides. Not one of these professionals conducted a trauma screening. Not one asked probing questions about her home life, or investigated the behavioral changes they documented in their files. When Grace pulled away during therapy, or seemed withdrawn on certain days, these observations were attributed to her disability, rather than recognized as potential signs of something far worse. The failures extended beyond healthcare. Grace's home health aide noticed changes in her behavior, but didn't report her suspicions to authorities. The physical therapist documented behavioral episodes without connecting them to any pattern of concern. The isolation that Harold imposed, reducing outside visits and canceling aid appointments, went unchallenged by anyone in a position to intervene. In a system stretched thin by funding cuts and overwhelming caseloads, Grace fell through cracks that should never have existed in the first place. She was failed by every institution that should have protected her, and the consequences of those failures will echo through her life forever. Perhaps most disturbing is the role Grace's disability played in masking the abuse. Because she could not communicate clearly, her attempts to disclose what was happening were dismissed or misinterpreted. Daddy, night, no, could mean almost anything when spoken by someone whose speech was already difficult to understand. Because she was dependent on her caregivers for survival, she had no avenue for seeking independent help. Because society often infantilizes people with disabilities, treating them as eternal children rather than full human beings with the same vulnerabilities and needs as anyone else, no one considered that Grace might be a victim of sexual violence. Research consistently shows that people with intellectual and developmental disabilities are 7 times more likely to experience sexual abuse than those without disabilities. 7 times. Yet training for healthcare providers, educators, and social workers on recognizing abuse in this population remains woefully inadequate in most states. The warning signs were documented across medical files, therapy notes, and aid reports, yet they were never connected into a coherent picture of abuse. The tragedy is that no one was trained to interpret what a disabled woman's behavioral changes truly meant. Grace's story demands that we do better. It demands that we train professionals to recognize the signs of abuse even when victims cannot speak for themselves. It demands that we create systems for nonverbal reporting and investigation. It demands that we stop assuming disability is a protection against predators, when, in reality, it often makes people more vulnerable. When the verdicts were handed down and the sentences pronounced, a question lingered in the minds of everyone who had followed this case. Was justice served? Harold Carter will spend his remaining years in federal prison, aging in protective custody, isolated from the world he once manipulated. He will never again have access to vulnerable children. He will never again walk free in the society he betrayed. By every legal measure, justice was accomplished. The perpetrator was caught, tried, convicted, and punished to the fullest extent the law allowed. But the case of Denise Holloway raises more complicated questions about what justice truly means. She committed serious crimes. There is no ambiguity about that. She shot her husband, then returned the following day to drug him with sleeping pills and stab him 11 times. In any other context, such actions would warrant severe punishment. Yet public sympathy overwhelmingly sided with her. Petitions for her release gathered hundreds of thousands of signatures. Legal commentators debated whether she should face any charges at all. Prosecutors, recognizing the extraordinary circumstances, offered reduced charges that resulted in a sentence of just 18 months. Was this justice? Or was it something else? A recognition that the rigid application of law sometimes fails to account for the full depth of human experience. Consider the question that faced Denise in that terrible moment when she opened Harold's laptop and saw what he had done. If you learned that your spouse had been sexually abusing your disabled child for years, recording the abuse as trophies, what would you do? Would you trust the justice system to handle it? Would you risk a trial where your daughter's trauma became public record, where defense attorneys questioned her reliability, where the outcome depended on the judgment of strangers? Or would you, in that moment of collapsed reality, take matters into your own hands? These are not questions with comfortable answers. They force us to confront the limits of law, the nature of retribution, and the primal instincts that lie beneath our civilized veneer. Some argue that Denise should have faced harsher consequences, that allowing emotional distress to mitigate violent crimes sets a dangerous precedent. Others contend that she should never have been charged at all, that her actions represented the natural response of any mother protecting her child. The truth likely lies somewhere in the complicated middle ground where most of human morality resides. Denise Holloway broke the law, and she paid for that with time in prison. But she also saved her daughter from a criminal the system had failed to detect. Perhaps justice in cases this complex cannot be reduced to simple verdicts and sentences. Perhaps it requires us to hold multiple truths simultaneously, to acknowledge both the crime and its context, to recognize that some situations push human beings beyond the boundaries of ordinary moral calculation. At the heart of this story, beneath all the horror and heartbreak and legal complexity, lies something simple and profound: a mother's love. Denise Holloway loved her daughter with a ferocity that defined her entire adult life. She worked double shifts so Grace could have physical therapy. She fought insurance companies and school districts and bureaucratic systems that seemed designed to wear parents down. She married a man she believed would help carry the burden of caregiving, trusting him with the most precious person in her world. And when she learned what that man had done, her love transformed into something else entirely. Something ancient. Something primal. Something that could not be contained by courtrooms or explained by psychology. Denise became an avenging force, a mother pushed beyond every limit of human endurance. And while the law judged her actions, requiring punishment for the violence she committed, the human heart understands what drove her to that violence. We understand because we know, deep in our bones, that we would do the same. Any parent who has held a child, who has watched that child sleep, who has imagined the 1,000 dangers that wait in the world, knows exactly what Denise felt when she opened that laptop. We know the rage that must have consumed her. We know the guilt that must have followed. And we know that, given the same circumstances, very few of us could claim we would have acted differently. In the years since her release, Grace has continued to develop her communication abilities. She has found her voice, both literally and figuratively, speaking with greater clarity than anyone thought possible. And there is one phrase she uses more than any other, whether she is speaking to her therapist, her aunt, her daughter, or her mother. 3 words that contain an entire universe of meaning. Mom, strong, love. It is perhaps the most eloquent summary of this story that anyone could offer. A mother who was strong enough to do terrible things in defense of her child. A daughter who survived the unsurvivable. A love that, despite everything, endured. Today, in a small house outside Columbus, Ohio, 3 generations of women share their lives together. Denise carries the weight of what she did and what she failed to prevent. Grace carries the scars of years of violation, but also the unexpected joy of motherhood. And Hope, named for what might still be possible, carries the future in her small hands. They are not defined by the abuser who once lived among them. They are defined by each other, by their resilience, by their survival, by the simple, extraordinary truth that life continues even after the unthinkable, that from the deepest darkness, light can emerge, that even hell itself cannot destroy a mother's love. Some stories don't begin with violence. They begin with a single sentence that rewrites everything. For Denise Holloway, that sentence came in a hospital corridor on a February night, and nothing was ever the same again. But the best stories, the ones that matter, the ones that stay with us long after the final words are spoken, end with something that cannot be destroyed. Connection, healing, hope. Thank you for watching. If this story moved you, if it made you think about the people in your life who might be suffering in silence, if it reminded you to listen more carefully to those who cannot easily speak for themselves, then please remember to like this video, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe to this channel for more stories like this one. Your support makes these stories possible. Until next time, stay safe, stay aware, and never stop listening to the people who need you most.